Hi, everybody. Today, I want to talk to you about what chronic fatigue syndrome is, how it occurs, and give you a broad framework for how I go about treating this very complicated condition. I see chronic fatigue syndrome both in how it develops and how we cure it as being like a snowball. It starts gradually, perhaps with one or two dysfunctions or toxin exposures, and it slowly picks up speed and gains strength as it begins to have a domino-like effect, affecting all of the areas of our body and all our different systems. And as all these different things become dysregulated, it becomes very difficult to treat because we can't just treat one thing and expect it to get better, even if that one thing is what started the snowball rolling down the hill in the first place. This is a very holistic disease and it requires a holistic treatment. And by that, I mean it requires looking at everything that's going wrong and not just one thing. Today, I am going to be talking about the 5 key players that are usually the starting point, and there you'll have to understand these key players before you can really understand how chronic fatigue syndrome works. The first key player is the autonomic nervous system. You may have heard me talk about this before. The autonomic nervous system is the part of your nervous system, the part of your brain that controls automatic functions in the body. It has 3 branches. It has the sympathetic fight or flight branch. It has the dorsal vagal branch, and it has the ventral vagal branch. The ventral vagal branch is typically known as the rest and digest response. It makes us open to social interactions. It helps us to digest our food properly. It helps us to feel relaxed and gives us a sense of well-being. Meanwhile, the dorsal vagal branch is the more primitive branch of the vagus nerve, and it causes what we call shutdown or playing dead. And it is a large component of the symptoms that we experience in chronic fatigue syndrome. Severe fatigue, pain. It makes you want to curl up into a ball and not do anything. That is the dorsal branch of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is connected to the very deep parts of our brainstem that control sleep, breathing, and also our hormone centers, which is why I consider the endocrine system the system in our body that regulates hormones and releases hormones into the bloodstream to be downstream of the autonomic nervous system rather than a key player in most cases. The vagus nerve is also attached all the way down our brain. It attaches to our heart and it attaches to our gut, along with many other things along the way. The second key player that is often affected first in chronic fatigue syndrome is the immune system. This is the part of our body that reacts to infections and foreign invaders. It is what helps our bodies distinguish between self and non-self. There are many different types of cells that are part of the immune system, and also our lymph nodes are part of the immune system. The third key player is actually 2 different things, but they're so closely interconnected that I roll them up into one, and that is our gastrointestinal tract and our microbiome. The GI tract, specifically the part of our GI tract that it is responsible for absorbing nutrients, when that's damaged, it will cause this snowball effect and affect everything else. But if the GI system is damaged, the microbiome will be damaged. The microbiome, as I'm sure you know, are all of the bacteria as well as yeasts, viruses, and many other different types of organisms that live symbiotically with us within our digestive system. Without a healthy microbiome, we cannot digest and absorb our food properly. And an unhealthy microbiome will also negatively affect the body. It may begin to eat the mucosal lining of our digestive tract, or it may cause hormonal imbalances that cause us to feel depressed, or cause many other dysfunctions in the body that we don't even have a really good sense of yet. It seems to affect everything about us, both physically and psychologically. If the microbiome is damaged, the gut will be damaged, and vice versa. They are inextricably linked. The fourth key player is the mitochondria. You may know the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell. They are an organelle, which means an organ of the cell. So they're found in almost all of the cells throughout our bodies, and they create a molecule called ATP. ATP is how the cell stores energy. And just as you might spend a dollar bill at a store in order to buy something, the cell spends ATP in order to buy any work that it does. If you want to contract a muscle, if and actually really it's more relaxing the muscle, but for simplicity's sake, in order to contract a muscle, you need to spend ATP. In order for the cell to simply survive, it needs to spend ATP in moving different electrolytes in and out of the cell, similar to how you need energy in order to breathe just to survive at a basic level, even if you're not doing anything else. So the mitochondria helps the cell to create the energy molecule ATP that it needs to do everything in order to function and in order to survive. However, the mitochondria also has a second function that is not as widely known, but in chronic fatigue syndrome, it's extremely important. The mitochondria acts as the part of the cell that recognizes and responds to danger or stress. If the cell is damaged, then the mitochondria will be the first to know. Because the mitochondria has such a high metabolism, it is the one that's, doing all of these processes. Any small change in the environment of the cell is going to be sensed by the mitochondria first. So, what the mitochondria does is when it senses danger or it senses damage to the cell, it will send a warning signal out. And it uses ATP as that warning signal. So, ATP within the cell is very good. But ATP outside of the cell is a danger signal, and the mitochondria will actually send ATP out of the cell so that it can warn both the cell and its neighbors that there is danger. ATP sort of acts like blood. Inside of our bodies, it's very necessary and good, but when we see blood, it sends this warning signal that there's something wrong. So the cell will bleed ATP. And ATP that's outside of the cell, we call extracellular ATP, or sometimes EATP if you're writing about it. And extracellular ATP is a very strong warning signal And when it attaches to receptors on the outside of the cell, then it will cause the cell's behavior to change. The change in behavior is adaptive because it helps the cell to survive stressors, infections, or damage. So, the sorts of changes that we might see in the cell when it's receiving an extracellular ATP signal, it would be things like shutting down its normal daily functions. It's If it's a cell that creates a hormone, maybe in the adrenal cortex, it may stop creating adrenal hormone. It may stop releasing insulin. It may stop doing whatever function it normally does so that it can focus its energy and attention on managing the threat. It's also going to take all of its mitochondria, which are usually closely associated and talking to one another, and it's going to move them apart and sequester them. This is helpful because one of the threats that the cell is expecting and needs to be able to respond to is the threat of a virus. And the virus uses the cell's energy and mechanics to replicate itself. So the cell's metabolism has to slow down and it has to be able to protect itself from the virus taking over its cellular machinery. The cell is going to stop responding and communicating to other cells around it. And again, that helps it to prevent being attacked by viruses. And if it is attacked by viruses, it helps to prevent spreading that virus. Also, if it's damaged or if there's lack of blood flow, then it's expecting there's not going to be as much ATP to go around. So, reducing its metabolism and reducing all of its normal functions is going to increase the chance that it's going to survive the threat. Now, this is a very adaptive and helpful response when it occurs occasionally, which it's supposed to. But if this extracellular ATP signal happens often or a lot, especially over time, then the cell actually has mechanisms that it uses in order to help the signal not be so disruptive. Now, if you think about it, bleeding ATP is a very expensive process. It's just like burning money in order to keep yourself warm. It's very expensive because this is its energy. So, if it's getting this signal all the time, in order to prevent all that energy being used up, what it does is it actually becomes more sensitive to the extracellular ATP signal so that it doesn't have to burn and spend as much of it in order to get the same response from itself and its neighbors. This is why, in chronic fatigue syndrome, it seems like what stressor used to be normal for us and not such a big deal, all of a sudden it causes these severe reactions in our body and makes us shut down. It's because on a cellular level, our danger signaling has not increased, but our sensitivity to the danger signal has. And that happens on a very deep cellular level to all of the cells in our body. And this extracellular ATP signal can travel throughout the whole body very fast, which is how you can experience perhaps a new medication or a little bit of exercise. And all of a sudden, those cells that were damaged when you went for a walk that would simply regenerate and heal themselves, maybe with a little bit of soreness, all of a sudden they're causing this huge response throughout your whole body. It's not that they're more damaged than before. They're sending the same extracellular ATP signal, but the cells of your body have become more sensitive to that signal, and so they have a stronger response to it. Okay, so that was mitochondria. We've gone through number 1, the autonomic nervous system, number 2, the immune system, number 3, the gastrointestinal system and the microbiome, number 4, the mitochondria, and number 5 are genetic factors and detox pathways. We do know that there are some genetic factors that predispose us to coming down with chronic fatigue syndrome. People who have an XX chromosome, for example, genetic females, we are more likely to develop this condition. And there are probably some other conditions that are associated with it. People who have parents or siblings or children with this condition are more likely to come down with it. But it's definitely not um, a sure thing. It's simply a predisposition. And we still have a lot to learn on this front. So, those are the 5 key players in chronic fatigue syndrome. And it's usually 1 or 2 of these key players that's the starting point for this snowball to begin running down the hill. Using my own illness as an example, it was probably my immune system or my gastrointestinal system or both that started the snowball of my illness. So I first started to get sick shortly after recognizing that I was having a response to gluten. Whenever I would eat gluten, I would itch. And, back when I was eating gluten all the time, I was just kind of itching a little bit all of the time. And when I tried going off gluten for a week and then I had pizza on Friday, I had this all over itching. And I was like, well, I guess I shouldn't eat gluten anymore. But I found that the more I avoided gluten, the more sensitive I became to it. And soon I went from eating gluten all the time, and other than a little bit of itching that I barely noticed, I was fine. But soon, whenever I had even a small contamination of gluten, I would itch all over and I'd have this big histamine response. It wasn't a true allergy. I never got anaphylaxis or swelling or even hives, but I knew from the itching that it was a histamine response. After experiencing this for several weeks, maybe a month or 2, I began to get severe fatigue in the days following an itching reaction. And what was happening in my body? Perhaps my cells were becoming more sensitive to extracellular ATP. Perhaps the immune system, these histamine creating cells called eosinophils, releasing histamine caused an extracellular ATP response from cells around them that were damaged or received this signal of danger. And then, as this extracellular ATP signal happened over and over and over again, and I was getting contaminated quite often because I was so sensitive that my body just became more sensitive to the signal, and I started getting more and more and more sick every time I was contaminated. It's also possible at the same time that my autonomic nervous system was learning to react to these signals as well. The cells that send the extracellular ATP out, they will affect the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system, just as they will all of the other cells in your body. And the autonomic nervous system it's actually a two-way communication. These extracellular ATP signals will affect the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system, but so too does the autonomic nervous system affect these cells, and it can make them more or less sensitive to extracellular ATP, or make it easier or harder for these cells to release extracellular ATP signals. So my whole body was affected, and you can look at it from bottom up, from the cell up to my nervous system and my conscious awareness, or bottom down, sorry, top down, from my conscious awareness and nervous system down to my cells. Both are equally valid, and they're not mutually exclusive. So, as my immune system dysfunction began to take hold, it started to affect the other key players. I developed gastrointestinal problems, SIBO, um, and other dysbiosis, dysfunction of the gut microbiome. I also had leaky gut, and I developed other food sensitivities besides gluten. My mitochondria and my autonomic nervous system became dysregulated, as I just talked about. As and then other downstream effects began happening as my gastrointestinal system was dysfunctional. My ability to absorb nutrients decreased, and I became deficient in iron and other vitamins. And this, of course, affected my ability to move oxygen around my body, which increased the extracellular ATP signaling of my cells. And you can see how these become self perpetuating cycles that begin to snowball more and more. I developed sleep dysregulation. I developed insomnia and trouble sleeping and staying asleep as my autonomic nervous system and hypothalamus became dysregulated. This, of course, led to another self perpetuating cycle where sleep deprivation caused increased stress on my nervous system and my cellular machinery, and I just got worse and worse. I developed hormone dysregulation, whether it's because the cells that created the hormones began to shut down because of their sensitivity to the extracellular ATP signaling, or whether the autonomic nervous system told them to shut down because there was so much stress on the body, or whether they didn't have the nutrients they needed in order to create the hormonal signals, or some combination of all three. I developed adrenal insufficiency. So even though when I did my 4-point salivary cortisol testing, my numbers were all fairly normal, I had symptoms of a, a deficiency in cortisol, which is a hormone created by the adrenal glands. And this would include things like, one, problems with waking up in the morning and going to sleep at night, because cortisol is what helps your body to wake up. And when the levels of cortisol go down, it helps your body to fall asleep. Two, I developed an intolerance to fasting. All of a sudden, I didn't have that cortisol signal to tell my body to release blood sugar from my liver into my bloodstream so that I could go more than several hours without eating. And instead, I started getting these big drops in blood sugar. I would get irritable and brain foggy, and I would have these huge sugar cravings, and my blood sugars were all over the place. And then, of course, this worsened my sleep dysregulation because I'd wake up around 2 a.m. just starving and feeling very anxious because my blood sugars were low. So you can see how this one issue with histamine has started to pick up speed and affect all of the different systems in my body in a way that becomes self perpetuating and just keep going and going and getting worse and worse and starting to affect all of these different systems. I developed cardiovascular dysregulation. I had trouble getting blood to my brain when I was standing, and something called orthostatic intolerance. And this was both because of the hormonal dysregulation that had the hormone that tells my kidneys to hold on to water wasn't functioning well. So even though I was drinking a bunch of water, I was peeing a bunch of water out and I didn't have enough blood volume. I developed psychological symptoms, anxiety, panic attacks, depression, things that I had never struggled with before. But when your blood sugars are going up and down, you feel anxious as you don't have the proper nutrition to actually synthesize the neurotransmitters that you need in order to be healthy. You develop anxiety and depression as you start having these dysregulated bursts of adrenaline and norepinephrine rather than the steady state of stress hormones that you're supposed to have. You develop these psychological symptoms. So there's all of these things playing into it. I also began to experience itching when I was in environments that seemed to have mold. Now, whether the mold intolerance was something that happened at the beginning that I didn't recognize until later, or whether it was a downstream effect, I still don't know to this day. And now, now, now that you've got a sense of all of the different things that were dysregulated in my body, it may feel completely overwhelming for like how to fix this, right? There's 101 things that are dysregulated and dysfunctional, and each one of those is making the others worse and keeping your whole system stuck in this dysregulated cycle. But the good news is, just as getting sick is a snowball effect, getting well is also a snowball effect. My path to wellness started out very slow, and it seemed like most of the things I was trying were not helping, or they weren't helping very much, or when they did help a lot, they slowly became less helpful over time. It wasn't until I recognized that I had to start doing all of these things at once that I really started to pick up speed with my healing. The first thing that I did that really helped was I started to strictly avoid gluten and other foods to which I was sensitive. This took a long time because gluten hides in places you don't expect. You can get contaminated in ways you don't expect. And it was very, very difficult. And this was one of the biggest things, getting rid of this core root cause that was super helpful, but it was not sufficient to get me well. I was still very sick. The second thing that I did is I started taking binders to help my body get rid of mold toxins. This is something that my functional medicine doctor, Dr. Steenstra, recommended. At the time, it didn't seem to do anything to help. I still don't know if this was something that contributed to my healing or not. If it did, it was only a single part, and I didn't really see the effects of it until later. But I have grown in my understanding, and whereas at the time I just kind of did it because she recommended it, I didn't really believe in any of it. Now I do think that it was a helpful part of my healing. Number 3, I was given hormonal support. Dr. Steenstra treated me first with active thyroid hormone called T3, and then later on started me on adrenal cortisol supplementation. And the synthetic cortisol is called Cortef or hydrocortisone. So we started both of those, and those were the medications that made me feel significantly better early on, but slowly seemed to lose effect. So I used them as a way to get through medical school, which was extremely important to me. But by the end of medical school, even on these medications, and actually I had stopped the thyroid because it was causing side effects and I didn't seem to need it after I was on the full dose of Cortef. But even on the full dose of Cortef, and I was taking all of the Cortef that somebody with Addison's disease would take. If an autoimmune disease had completely wiped my adrenal glands clean, that's the dose of Cortef I was taking, and I was still very ill. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I understand that the cortisol deficiency I was experiencing was simply a downstream effect of these other key dysfunctions. And without addressing these other key dysfunctions, I wasn't going to get better. The fourth thing I did that really helped, and this was probably when I really started to see true improvement, it was a recommendation given to me by the ANS Rewire program, and that was to eat balanced meals regularly, 6 times a day. And in my heart, I knew this would be helpful because my inability to tolerate fasting was so severe, and I could tell I was getting these huge adrenaline spikes when I didn't eat, and my blood sugar would drop and I would feel horrible. Um, but I had never really thought that just paying attention to my body signals and giving my body what it seemed to be asking for would make such a huge difference. So, yeah, and of course, thinking ahead about what I'm going to eat when and making sure it's prepared and ready, and then eating before I get such a big drop in blood sugar that I'm too tired to get off the couch to get myself something to eat. It took a lot of work, but putting that effort in was extremely worth it to me and was the start of my snowball of actually starting to get better in ways that I could see and ways that kept getting better rather than seeming to drift off. Number 5, I reduced the stress on my psychology and my autonomic nervous system. I graduated from medical school, first of all. I began these mind body techniques of guided meditations and just paying attention to like when I was stressed out and doing other things to reduce my psychological stress and begin sending signals of safety through my vagus nerve to my cells to let them know it's okay. We can start healing. We don't have to be on high alert all the time. And it was these steps that started to snowball the re-regulation of my system, and I eventually got better. And now that I understand what the dysregulations are and how to infuse regulation back into my body, when I do get glutened, which will cause a severe histamine reaction, my cells will still over-respond. I know how to get better quickly. And I use all of these tools all at once. The rest, the not pushing myself into post-exertional malaise, the eating regularly so I'm not getting hypoglycemia, the I don't use the hormonal support or the mold binders anymore because I just don't need them. But I have all of these other tools in my toolbox now, and I know how to get myself better. So that's kind of my whole story. And I know that your key issues and your downstream dysregulations are going to look somewhat different from mine. The main idea that I want you to gather from this is the idea of the snowball effect. There are many, many things that have gone wrong in your system. And in order to begin righting them, it's important to address many different dysregulations all at once. In order to heal, you're going to need to dedicate several months just to healing. If you're trying to work a job and take care of a partner who's in trouble, if you're experiencing all this stress or you're trying to, go out with your friends and do all of these things that your body is telling you it's not ready for, then it doesn't really matter what sort of support I'm trying to give your system because you're still pushing it into post exertional malaise. We're going to need to work together and we're going to need to take a few months to dedicate solely to addressing these root causes, supporting the dysregulations that have come as a secondary effect, and begin to rehabilitate your autonomic nervous system so that your cells begin to move out of this cellular stress response and back into the health cycle and homeostasis. I hope this all makes sense. I look forward to working with you and beginning to support you along this healing journey. Take care.